Hello everyone, my name is Abhishek and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, let's try to understand what is kubectl port forward, why to use it, when to use it, and most importantly, how it actually works. Towards the end of this video, I'm also going to perform a demonstration on the Kubernetes cluster where I will cover different use cases of kubectl port forward. For example, how to use port forwarding from your local machine, how to use it when you're using a cloud machine, maybe EC2 instance or Azure VM, and also how to deal with ports not available. So we will cover all of these use cases in the video. Make sure you watch it till the end. So first things first, let's understand what exactly is port forward. To be very honest, this concept is not at all new. This concept exists even before Kubernetes because port forwarding is very widely used in the world of networking. So first let's understand what is port forwarding in the world of networking, and then let's learn how kubectl adopted this concept. So the textbook definition of port forwarding says port forwarding is a mechanism or is a concept of mapping a port on your machine, on your local machine, with the port on the remote server. Or it is also mapping port on one machine with a port on another machine. The only condition is that both of these machines have to be in the same network, or they should be able to connect with each other. I know it's little confusing. So let's take a use case so that we understand much better. I'll take a very popular use case. So let's say there is a system administrator and sysadmin on this EC2 instance. Let's say this is a client machine. And on this client machine, sysadmin has deployed a database. Now, eventually, the system administrator should allow the access to this database only from the client machines because this is a client database. But how system administrator can confirm or verify that the database is accessible through the API, right? Only few machines, only the client machines have to access the database. But how do you confirm that? So you need to first test it, obviously. Now, the problem is that if you open the security group and let's say you set up the inbound security rules, so the instance will be open and a lot more people can access the database. So you don't want to do it. So in this case, what you can actually do, or what the system administrator can actually do, is on the sysadmin's local machine, maybe a laptop. So sysadmin can use this concept called SSH port forward, where SSH port forwards sets up a secure tunnel between these machines. So it's a SSH tunnel that is set up between these machines, and this SSH tunnel maps port on the local machine with port on the remote server. If you assume the database port is 3306, so using SSH port forward, system administrator can set up a secure tunnel with port 80 or any port on the local machine with the port 3306 on the remote server. The advantage of this is that now the system administrator can just run local host colon 80 because the tunnel, the endpoint port of the tunnel is 80. So when they run localhost colon 80, the request is first sent to this particular port, right? When system administrator runs this localhost colon 80 on the browser, the request is first sent to the port 80 on the localhost, and this request through the tunnel is securely carried to the port 3306 on the remote machine. So it's a very interesting concept, and it adds a lot of security, and it's quite easy to set up this tunnel, right? Just run one single command and the tunnel is set up. Of course, you might ask, but Abhishek, it can be done in other ways. Quite obviously, but it takes a lot of effort, right? Whitelisting of particular IPs, blacklisting. Instead, create a simple tunnel using SSH port forward, test it, and once the testing is done, just stop this command and the tunnel is closed. That's it. Now, this concept, because there are a lot of advantages of it, and this is quite heavily used in terms of local testing. Now, this was inspired by kubectl, and what kubectl said. So let's say on your local machine, right? A lot of people run Kubernetes on their local machine for practicing or for learning or even for testing. So let's say I have my laptop, and on my laptop, I am running a local Kubernetes cluster using Docker as driver. A lot of people use Minikube. So what I'm trying to say is, let's say you created a Kubernetes cluster using Minikube start hyphen driver Docker. Or you might be using kind, which by default use a Docker container because it's Kubernetes in Docker. Or maybe you're using K3D. In all of these cases, a Kubernetes cluster is spin up on your laptop or on your local machine within a container. So if you assume this is the container, so within this container, a Kubernetes cluster is set up. Now, when you deploy a application or a pod within this Kubernetes cluster, and when you expose this pod as a simple Kubernetes service, it can be accessed within this Kubernetes cluster for sure. And if you expose this in the node port, it can also be accessed within the container. But what if you want to access using a port on your laptop? Let's say I'm running Minikube on my laptop, and what I want to do is I actually want to access the application that is deployed on the Kubernetes cluster from my browser. So a mapping needs to be done between a port on the local host or my laptop with a port on the Kubernetes cluster. Only then I can access on localhost colon 80 or localhost colon 8080 or something, right? So how to do this? Just like how SSH port forwarding is implemented, kubectl can actually create this tunnel for you, right? So kubectl, so there is this kubectl port forward command. Using the kubectl port forward command, you can actually set up a tunnel between. So these are kind of two different machines itself. The only thing is that the container is running within your laptop, but they are isolated networks, right? So kubectl port forward can set up a mapping between a port on your laptop and a port that is running within the Kubernetes cluster. And once you do this mapping, whenever you access localhost colon, let's say 80 or localhost colon 8080, whatever is the mapped port, you can access the application running within the Kubernetes cluster. Now you might ask, but Abhishek, instead, I can also, if if my instance supports something like ingress controller, I can also set up all that thing. For sure, you can definitely do it. But just for your local testing, do you want to set up ingress, ingress controller, and all the other configuration? It becomes too much if you are only trying to test your application. So instead, you can use the kubectl port forward. We will try to see on my local machine so that you understand what I'm trying to explain. So I have this terminal, right, where I'll just cd, and first thing I'll show you that I have a Kubernetes cluster that is running. So if I do kubectl get nodes, so this is my Kubernetes cluster. Now the thing is, I'm using a kind Kubernetes cluster because it's very lightweight in nature, but the steps are exactly same even if you use Minikube. Now within this, within this Kubernetes cluster, let's try to run a popular application like Argo CD. So I'll go to Argo CD docs and let's click on get started. First, we will create a namespace, kubectl create namespace Argo CD, and let's try to run this particular command. Now this command creates a lot of resources of Argo CD. When I do kubectl get pods -n Argo CD and watch for the resources, so it's trying to create various pods. Now what I need is I want to access the server, right? I just want to access the UI of Argo CD, which is managed by the Argo CD server. Quite obviously, you cannot do it with the pod because pod only comes with the cluster network. So let's try to see if there is any service. So kubectl get svc -n Argo CD. Yes, there is a service for Argo CD and it is in the cluster IP mode. You might think that Abhishek, if I just change kubectl edit svc Argo CD server and the namespace, and if I just change, Abhishek, I can just change the type to node port where a node port is created, and after that I can access from my browser or from my laptop. It actually does not work because if I just do kubectl get svc -n Argo CD, right? So the Argo CD server, it the node port is 33018. So when I do localhost 33018, let's confirm. Yeah, sorry, 30318. It does not work. Why? Because if you try to understand carefully, you are not running the Kubernetes cluster on your machine. So there is another machine, although it's a container. So you have another machine that you have created, and within this server, the Kubernetes cluster is running. And within the Kubernetes cluster, you have your application or Argo CD running. So by default, this container has access to the K8s network. So from this container, you can access the Argo CD. Now, I want to access from my laptop, which is almost a different server, right? So for that, what we will do is we will set up kubectl port forwarding. Now, that's very easy to do. All that you need to do is run this command kubectl port -forward, followed by you can provide svc -argo cd server, and you need to map a port on your local machine first. So let's say I provide the port as 9000 with the service port or deploy or the pod port, replica set port, anything. Like you can give the service port, you can give the pod port, you can just provide the deployment, or you can provide replica set. Anything is same, because end of the day, through service or through replica set, through deployment, through pod, the request only goes to the container. So it doesn't matter whatever you are trying to provide. First, only thing is that anything that you try to provide, you need to mention that resource here. So because I am providing service Argo CD server, I should provide the service port. What is the service port? 80. So I'll just say kubectl port forward SVC Argo CD server map the port 9000 on my machine with port 90 of the Argo CD service server. Okay. So hyphen n Argo CD is a namespace. Now, when I do this, it says that, okay, Abhishek, I did the port forwarding. Now let's just change the port to 9000 and try. See, it works. Accept the risk, and we have the Argo CD instance here. So using kubectl port forward. Now this is only required when you are running Kubernetes using Docker driver. If you are using Hyper-V or if you're using Oracle VirtualBox, this might not be needed, subjected to your configuration, where exactly and how exactly you're running. But if you're using a Docker driver, because of this complexity, because you have your server, a container, within the container you have Kubernetes, you need this concept, right? Now, Abhishek, a slightly different or a slightly complex use case. What if, you know, I have my laptop, but because of some reasons, now I am not running Kubernetes cluster within my laptop. What if I have an EC2 instance, and within this EC2 instance, I'm running a container, like I'm running Minikube. So it created a container because of the Docker driver. And within that, so this is container, and within the container, I have my Kubernetes cluster. Now, how can I access the Kubernetes EC2 instance from my laptop? That is, I want to access from my browser. Now, in that case, what you need to do is that first, you need to set up tunnel exactly like I've explained, right? I'm running this command on my local machine. So you should be running same command, exactly the same command on your EC2 instance, so that a tunnel is set up on the port of your EC2 instance with a container port of your Kubernetes cluster. But only change that you do if you're using EC2 instance is that at the end of the command, or after kubectl port forward, wherever, just pass hyphen hyphen address 0.0.0.0. Now, when you do this, instead of accessing on the local host, just like how I access this on local host, when you pass this hyphen hyphen address 0.0.0.0 and run this command on your EC2 instance, then you can go back to your machine, you can go to your browser and access it on the IP address of your EC2 instance. That is the public IP address of your EC2 instance, colon the port. If your EC2 instance IP address is 3.4.5.6, so you will say 3.4.5.6 colon 9000. Of course, you need to open the inbound traffic port and all. But if you have this use case, because I've seen some people, they don't use their personal machine, just like how I'm using. In fact, a lot of people don't do this because of their configuration issues. Some people might not have a laptop with enough resources. So they go with this approach where they use their browser. to access the application. But the Kubernetes cluster is actually running on an EC2 instance or EKS or wherever it is, right? So you will do the kubectl port forward exactly as I've shown in the video, but you will append this hyphen hyphen address 0.0.0.0. Now, Abhishek, what if, like, I'm providing this, right? I'm saying map my local host port 9000 with port 80. Now, what if my 9000 is not available? Like, right? So I wanted to expose it on port 9000. So I ran this command, but unfortunately, the port is not available. One is you can just identify which process is using the port, either delete it or keep it. To be safer side, like Abhishek, I'm not sure which ports are available, which ports are not available. So instead of providing something like this, like I provided 9000, right? Just leave this field blank. So for example, if I leave this field blank like this, now kubectl port forward itself, it will identify a open port on your machine. So it will find out an open port on your machine and it will set up a tunnel with that port. For example, now when I run this, I don't know which port gets generated. So it randomly found out a port called 62708. Now I need to access localhost 62708, right? And next time when I run this command, if I do the same thing, it will take another port 62724, right? So this is how, when you're not sure, some people run it as part of their CI/CD pipelines, right? And they are not aware which port, because in their CI/CD pipeline, they might be using port forward for a step, testing step, and they're not sure which ports are available, which ports are not available. So they can do this implementation of just leaving the port, just colon and the remote port. So this is the concept of kubectl port forward, where a lot of people get confused. I have seen, because on our Slack channel, we get most of the questions with kubectl port forward itself. So I thought I will make a dedicated video and try to help everyone. I hope this concept is clear. Make sure you understand, are you using this use case where you're running Kubernetes cluster on your laptop, or you're using this use case where you're running Kubernetes cluster on a EC2 instance, but you want to access your application, a project that you have deployed from your laptop. Only difference is you pass hyphen hyphen address in this case and not in this case. You can also pass it here. There is no problem, but still just saying, right? So thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you found it useful and informative. Let me know in the comment section if you still have any questions. Take care, everyone. See you. Bye-bye.